Well, wonderful turnout. Welcome, everybody. I'm Dom Massaro, president of the UCSC Emeriti Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight for Louis Watt's lecture on immigration then and now. And after the talk, there'll be a question period, and I want to remind you, when you want to ask a question, please wait for the microphone so we can all hear you. So we give these Emeriti lectures twice a year, once in the fall and once in the spring, with support from the Chancellor to celebrate research by Emeriti faculty that have done their scholarship after retirement. And I should note that Louis was also awarded some financial support for the project he'll be talking on tonight from an endowment from an Edward A. Dixon Emeriti professorship, which rewards creative and scholarly contributions after retirement. So spouses and significant others, you should remind your emeriti to apply for these funds. They're given annually. So Louis will be introduced by Herman Gray, a professor of sociology who has published widely in the areas of Black cultural history, politics, and media. Herman?
Thank you, and welcome. I had seen some of Louis's photographs and did not know they were his, mostly some of the jazz pictures from the Harlem West series. Then I got to know Louis when he, David Wellman, and me commuted together for the better part of 2 years from the East Bay to UCSC, where Louis was a tenured professor in the art department. What better way to get to know someone than talking travel, jazz, and while driving through stop-and-go traffic on 880 and through rainstorms on Highway 17. We got to know each other. As we got to know each other, we realized that we had an awful lot in common, jazz and travel, and that we knew a lot of the same people. For instance, we ran into each other at a retirement conference and later dinner party for a mutual friend in New York City. And having written about Teresa Records, a jazz independent recording label in the Bay Area, I came later to learn that Louis was a key figure among a group of Bay Area musicians, jazz writers, and photographers, including Kathy Sloan, composer and drummer Anthony Brown, and writers Ishmael Reed and Al Young. All of this is by way of saying that Louis reminds us of the lives and adventures of a generation of itinerant writers, artists, musicians, and photographers from the late 1940s and 50s. I'm thinking of Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, Chester Himes, Gordon Parks, Roy DeCarver. He reminds us of what their lives must have been like. With nothing more than notepads, camera, and typewriter, they took off for far-flung parts of the globe in search of interesting people and a good story. In this quality, too, Louis is very much at one with his own generation of photographers, including those showcased in Thomas Allis Harrison's wonderful documentary, Through a Lens Darkly. Photographers like Carrie Mae Weems, Deb Willis, Lorna Simpson, Howard Bingham, and Corinne Simpson. As with the photographers, writers, and culture workers of a previous generation, Louis engages the large themes of his time. His seminal works on San Francisco and New Orleans focus on the history, everyday life, and vibrant cultures of people and places, a theme he continues in his most recent work on migration. These works bring together two of Louis's passions, politics and culture, art and everyday life. Documenting the vibrant world of the Fillmore or the Harlem of the West helps to place Black San Francisco within the history of the region and the nation. Similarly, New Orleans Suite, co-authored with our own Eric Porter, gives the readers and viewers a sense of the amazing world of New Orleans, its people, culture, sounds, and textures. As in all of his work, New Orleans suite brings together the vibrant and the quotidian cultures of the city, both before and in the wake of Katrina, showing us what was lost, but also how the very quotidian quality of its encounter with difference makes the city, as Lewis likes to say, like no other in North America. This encounter with the large issues of our time places Lewis squarely in the tradition of photographers who approach photography as a technology of blackness and as a means to expose and contest race and racism as technologies of power. With his most recent work on migrations, Lewis is helping us to see various forms of difference, both as the site of displacement, dislocation, and resettlement, and as a rich and resilient global expression and force on the move. As with his work on the quotidian lives of Black folks in New Orleans, San Francisco, Paris, Turkey, and South Africa, the nuanced viewpoint, the sensitivity to humanity of his subjects, whether in the Fillmore, the Ninth Ward, or in the camps, Lewis's pictures shows his respects for his subjects and their circumstance. He is a close observer, attentive to the art of politics and the politics of art, the sounds of seeing and seeing sound. His photographs invite us to ponder not just loss and displacement as tragedy, but also hope and possibility. In the bleak aftermath of Katrina or the migrant camps of Europe and North Africa, Lewis's pictures force a reckoning with loss, and yet he manages to find a way to convey the sense of resilience in the glance of the eyes, the stance of the pose, in those moments of audible sound, of hope made visible. Like a good visual ethnographer, Lewis has the manner and bearing that both puts others at ease and allows him to move among and in worlds and spaces that most of us could not. His pictures are, in a sense, intimate without being intrusive, revealing without surveilling, or, as Greg Tate would put it, loving without theft. In Known and Strange Things, photographer and critic Teju Cole comments on the relationship between photography and memory, concerned with photography's quickness to memorialize in the age of digital disposability. Cole's caution against the easy slippage of one into the other. Cole's caution prompts me to think about Lewis's photographs of communities, people, histories, and places in relationship to the spaces that his pictures resist memorializing, yet insist that we remember. His pictures do some of that work for us, and I, for one, am grateful. Lewis.
Hi, everybody. So I'm not sure how I follow that, but we'll see where we can go. I have a couple of things to say. One is that 4 days ago, I took a 30-hour plane ride from Johannesburg here. And since I've been back, I've been concentrating on this and about 4 grants that were due before I got back that I got extensions for. So this is going to be a really interesting lecture. When Dominic asked me to do this talk, I said, I can't do this now. I'm right in the middle of my research. And I realized that this is actually the perfect time because I've just come back from a pretty amazing, epic journey, and I have a whole bunch of material that I really was forced to sort of look at probably sooner than I would have. So what I'm hoping is some of you will have, there's people in this room that have actually known me a long time, but some of you will have some ideas about kind of exactly what it is I'm doing. So I wanted to begin with a book that was purportedly the hymnal for a lot of my work. I hope you know about The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, an amazing book that is a kind of case study of migration, the African-American migration in the 20th century, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. When I started reading that book, it was basically really the kind of soundtrack to the sort of research that I've been doing, and I'm actually going to be curating an exhibit by a number of artists from different generations and their take on this migration and how it affected their lives. So I'm hoping that will happen sometime soon. So originally, I was going to talk, I'm going to do a little bit, but I'm going to do less than I had thought originally. I was going to talk about the connection between my earlier work, the work that was informed by my own parents' story as Southern-born, and because of World War II being, my father was discharged from the Army in Fort Lewis and kind of meandered into Seattle and ended up working for the Urban League there for 14 years. So I spent from 4 months to 14 years in Seattle after having been born in Little Rock, because my mother went back to Little Rock to have me because she knew the doctors. So that comes in handy when I'm photographing in the South and people say, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm Southern born," all 4 months. So when I became a photographer, my background is in social science and history. And I remember saying, "Oh, I'm an artist now. All that stuff about culture and history is beyond me." But of course, that's been all my work is. This is one of the first photographs I took when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. And I took it in West Oakland, and really it sort of sums up this story. There's a lot of people came from Texas and Louisiana to West Oakland. And here's the sort of hand-painted, beautiful sign, which actually I couldn't find after I took it. And when I had a show at the Oakland Museum, someone said, "Oh, they sold that house, and you might be able to find the sign." So if anybody knows where that sign is, I would love to have it, because it really is important. Here's a picture at the New Oakland train station, and Mrs. Waters has come actually from the Central Valley for her daughter's wedding. But I thought it was absolutely indicative of the idea of people arriving by train or by bus throughout the 20th century, in many cases without much money, and they sort of were able to make their life. And that sort of narrative is something I've been really interested in tracing. And they brought with them, obviously, religious belief, the whole notion of storefront churches, sanctified churches, and also a sense of improvisation, sort of the idea that you use the resources available to you to sort of navigate through life. And kind of always had this idea, part of this work was done in black and white because I thought time was really important as an element, and the black and white was kind of placing this in a particular time that I was both thinking about and also how things from the past were sort of continuing to the present. I actually love this woman's expression. This is sort of the expression you get a lot when you photograph, and people are sort of wondering what it is you're up to. And you have to kind of navigate that and sometimes try to charm people and sometimes not succeed in doing it. This was Joe, someone I found in Garvey Park in West Oakland. And I love this idea of sort of improvisation in terms of sort of game and group collection. I now live in Richmond, which is sort of the place where there's actually a park, the Rosita Riveter Homefront National Park. And the idea of Richmond seems to be a place that has a lot of ghosts. This is actually in the headquarters for the national park. I did a book called Harlem of the West, which was began with a series of found images from the Fillmore district in San Francisco that basically developed in 1941 after Pearl Harbor and the Japanese were interned. It was San Francisco's Japantown. So as people came west, the only place that there was housing was in this area in the Western Addition. And it was actually an entertainment center and had an infrastructure. So almost immediately there were 7 or 8 jazz clubs, black-owned hotels, churches, and restaurants. And then in the late 60s, the whole area was redeveloped away, and most traces of that life had disappeared. So I was able to find a cache and then worked with people who were doing a documentary at KQED, and eventually did a book called Harlem of the West. The Chronicle books published and went out of print, but in February or March, a new edition of it will be coming out. So look for that in wherever your bookstores, local bookstores. So that I was going to say, this is a picture of the Texas Playhouse. That's Wesley Johnson with the hat. The woman he's talking to is a woman named Leola King, who, when we were first researching the book, would not give us any of her materials, and it turned out she had a club, and when the book came out, she loved what we had done and actually then gave us her archive before she passed. But this is the Texas Playhouse, this mural, and it says these are Texas boys, and that's Eddie Taylor, Teddy Wilson, Eddie Cleanhead Vincent, and a couple of others who I can't see without my glasses. So besides photographing kind of the destination, I was really interested in going to the source of this migration. This is actually from a place called Project Row House in Houston in the 3rd Ward. And it basically, there are a lot of shotgun houses, which actually is a Creole designed house. And they sort of collected them because they were being torn down, and actually it's a residency, artist residency, and it's run by women from the community that sort of keep it going, and so it's pretty successful. This is a photograph taken of a church that was burned in the mid-90s in Greensboro, Alabama. I arrived in the afternoon, and they said, well, you're going to stay for the prayer service. And this was in the middle of the summer when it's 99 degrees, 100% humidity. And actually, in that atmosphere, I think any sort of expression of faith is absolutely viable. And I remember that they said they had burned the building, but they had not touched the church. It was actually very moving. This is a mural on Beale Street in Memphis. It might be Billie Holiday, it might be Bessie Smith. It was actually used, the picture was used in a cover of an album by Branford Marsalis. So New Orleans had been on my kind of list as a place to visit, and in 1994, I actually was commissioned to do a project on people who are doing community organizing, so I jumped at the chance, and immediately sort of was not surprised that it was full of really rich material. And not the least of was the fact that a lot of transplants from Louisiana came to California, so there's sort of connections. But as people say, New Orleans is actually a Caribbean city, it's a European city, it's definitely an African city, and it's also in the middle of the Deep South. So all that combination of things is really interesting and rich, and it really is a place where things happen that don't happen anywhere else in the world. This is an altar to Marie Laveau, who was a priestess, a voodoo priestess. And it was interesting, voodoo in the New World was actually an amalgamation of a lot of beliefs. And if you look, you'll see a picture of the Madonna. There's actually sort of Buddhist iconography and a Haitian cloth. And so this whole idea of it being a combination of belief was a way of sort of coping and developing belief as it was sort of taken when people were taken from their homeland. This is St. Roch's. It's a cemetery and chapel, and St. Roch's is the patron saint of miracle cures. And it's interesting, I photographed this, I think in 1998, and then I went back and photographed it after the storm. This was completely engulfed with water, and it looked exactly the same. It was interesting that a lot of New Orleans, because of the climate, a lot of places did not change after the storm because the climate's hard enough that it didn't. I did see other examples of it. My first visit, I remember walking on Rampart Street. I love that New Orleans has the names of streets that are songs I've heard for many years. I guess that's what happens. But I heard some music coming from a housing project, and this was a wake for the young man whose picture is on the T-shirt of the woman, and it was my first introduction of sort of the idea of celebration of death. And also how music and how important music was in that celebration. And the tradition is that usually on the way to the graveyard, there would be somber music. And then after the person was because they were buried because their sort of terrible life was over, the musicians would improvise, and many people say that that was the source of jazz, that they would sort of play up tempo and improvise on the way back. The other thing was I was supposed to do a residency during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and Hurricane Katrina intervened, and so I was not able to get there till 6 weeks afterwards. And I was in an exhibit in New York about the storm, and there were a number of people from New Orleans and other places, and the New Orleans photographers were complaining about the fact that a lot of people came to New Orleans and photographed and did books and left and were never heard from again. And then they said, but we like your work, which I thought was really nice. And so as a result of that, they said, Mardi Gras is coming, be sure, come and I'll hook you up. And my friend Eric Waters, who is the official photographer of the Mardi Gras Indians and the social and pleasure clubs has been really instrumental in kind of giving me access to things that I would not have been able to before. This is David Montana, whose brother was Tootie Montana, who was one of the sort of big chiefs. The Indians who come out during Mardi Gras and they work on these suits were being harassed by the police, and he was at a hearing. His brother was at a hearing with the city council and actually died at that hearing because he was so stressed. It was really interesting graffiti. This is on St. Claude's, and this is just at the entrance to the lower Ninth Ward. And there's reference, biblical and James Baldwin reference, which I thought was apropos. So if Eric's here, we'll be signing. Maybe we'll be signing books. He'll be signing books. I'm not signing anything, but there are books out in the hallway if you're interested in seeing the New Orleans Suite. We called it New Orleans Suite after a composition that Duke Ellington was commissioned to do during the first Jazz and Heritage Festival I think in 1980 or 90. And we kind of look at it as both a cautionary tale and a kind of model, because Eric's father is from Louisiana, but neither one of us was from New Orleans. And so we were both interested in Duke Ellington's composition, which had many elements of the culture of New Orleans, but what people from New Orleans said, he also missed some things because he's not from there. And so we were very sort of curious and are very cautious about that. So another place that I've actually been photographing probably and going to, even though I've only lived there for like 3 or 4 months at a time, is Harlem, which is, I think, is the cultural center of African American life in North America. This is actually an interesting sort of urbanized wishing well, which I think someone was pining for home. This is on a Sunday morning in Harlem in front of the brownstones. And the other thing was Harlem is actually a very international city. This is on the last day of Ramadan on 110th Street in Harlem. So this idea of kind of how people occupy, black people mostly, but how people occupy space and the traces they leave, I think has kind of been the sort of driving force behind my work. So in 2013, I was invited to present at a Black Arts Conference that was organized by Deborah Willis from NYU. And I went to Paris for the first time since I was in college. I hadn't been there for 40 years. And I remember in college, I was there for 10 days and really liked it. The French seemed to like me, which is not always the case with Americans. And so when I got off the plane, I sort of kicked myself and said, why is it taking me so long to get back? And I said, well, I'll take some pictures. And almost immediately, the train from Charles de Gaulle is exactly very similar to the A train, where it goes through different communities, and the Afghanis got off on one stop, the Moroccans got off on another, very much like traveling in from New York. And then, just as I got into Paris, these 5 young black men with backwards baseball caps got on, and they did not look like they were copying anything. It turns out French hip-hop is the second largest selling, and it's very viable, and there's all kinds of connections between Brooklyn and Paris. And so there's all these things that got my attention, and I immediately started photographing and got contacts in Paris the people that sort of helped me to find things to photograph. So these are sort of some of my pictures, and I was interested in the fact that there are generations of people of color from the colonies who've been in France for multiple generations, and many of whom consider themselves French. And the other French, there's sort of some discussion about who is French. I mean, all of a sudden the French have woken up and they have a very diverse country. So this was in the Porte de Paton, the beautiful metro station. There's a couple in Ménilmontant near Belleville. She's from Morocco and he's Senegalese. This is taking a bus in Marseille. Marseille in the south of France, which is very much like New Orleans and Oakland and probably like a town in North Africa. And I was just interested in, again, sort of who was there and how they were existing. This was interesting to me, an installation about the girls who were kidnapped in Nigeria, and the fact that it would also be in English in the Place de République. The Place de République seems to be the area where a lot of kind of political manifestations happen. It was where the thousands of people gathered after Charlie Hebdo and a number of the others. So someone said, you should need to go to a Museum of the History of Immigration, which is on the outskirts of Paris. It used to be the Colonial Museum, and if you look in the background, there are all these kind of idealized reliefs on the wall of all the happy natives in the Caribbean and Africa. And the space was occupied by immigrants saying that this place needs to have our voice, and I think as a result, there are now 2 sort of floors of galleries that have exhibits in the voice of immigrants. So I thought that was interesting, again, in terms of my interest in sort of how culture and experience and life goes from one place to the other. But I was also interested in kind of what is America's kind of most recent and successful export, and I have to say it seems to be hip-hop. As I see examples of hip-hop in Greece, out in the country. Certainly I was in South Africa where I was, definitely in Northern Europe, and most definitely in Paris. And I was really interested in kind of the style and sort of ways that people kind of expressed themselves and how they were kind of moving in the society, and just and then things that sort of referenced home. This picture maybe could be taken in Brooklyn or in Oakland, although I think he is definitely African. So I actually started staying in the flat originally through Airbnb, and then we kind of made arrangements outside of that. But this is a woman, my friend Barbara, who works for an NGO, and she spends a lot of time in Burkina Faso and Mauritania. And so she was gone a lot, and so I was actually able to stay in the same place in Ménilmontant. Probably of the 10 trips I've been there, I've stayed there about 7 times. And so I can walk out the street and people actually know me. Hardly anybody speaks English on that street except for me. And it's I like being in a place, in a sort of someone's home, and using that as a kind of to do concentric circles as a way to explore the place where I am. And so that's been a really good thing. So she said, I want to give you something. And it turns out this puppet was made by a puppeteer from the Congo who was actually inscripted as a child soldier, and was a child soldier probably for 5 or 6 years, escaped when he was maybe 12 or 13 and didn't say a word for about 5 years, and then saw a Mickey Mouse cartoon, and actually then became really interested in puppeteers. He's now one of the foremost puppeteers in Europe. So this is the puppet that's one of my prized possessions, especially sort of knowing the story. I was really interested in kind of who was doing what, especially in different parts of France. This is actually a demonstration in support of Palestinian rights, and I was again interested who was in that demonstration. Last month when I was in Paris, there was an exhibit called Color Lines, which was a really interesting kind of French take on the struggle for civil rights in America. The French really are very interested in African American culture, a place that I think they sincerely really admire it, to the point sometimes of fetishizing it, but it's sort of interesting to sort of see how they negotiate that. And I was really interested in a video that there was one of our own, Tyler Stovall, who's actually one of my French guides, his book, and he's also been very sort of generous with me in terms of going. So I was just interested in sort of what I was seeing in sort of art studios, in advertising, and then just also the way that people were reflecting kind of sort of elements of culture. This is in the Parc de Belleville, and this artist, you see a lot of his work all over Paris. This is in Chateau Rouge. I thought it was an interesting choice of films to be showing at that point. This is in Canal de Saint-Martin. I couldn't resist that tie. The man was very clean. And then I was really interested in kind of just observing kind of how people were being. The metro seemed to be a good place. I think as a Californian, I'm always interested in New York and other places where I can do public transportation, because it really is a great way to observe people. And I'll talk a little bit about the efficacy of photographing from the hip a little later, but I do more of it in France because my French is a little better, but it's really horrible. And because I can't talk my way out of or in situations, I've actually found it more difficult to photograph there than other places, which I thought was interesting. Here's a family at Versailles. They were middle class. I talked to them a little bit, and I thought it was interesting. I don't know if it's even that unique, but I love the picture a lot, and I love the fact that they were at Versailles. Great set of markets all over Paris. And again, it's interesting that a lot of the new immigrants who have the experience of going to the market where they come from would be some of the major customers. There's actually sort of a crisis that a lot of the millennials are not shopping at the markets. They're shopping in health food stores, and there's a whole kind of controversy about it. This is in the market in Chateau Rouge, and he's from Senegal selling okra, and his word in his language for okra was gumbo, which I thought was really interesting, another thing about sort of proving that New Orleans may be the most African city in North America. I've actually been there during Ramadan a couple of times, and it seems to be very difficult to photograph people identify as being Muslim during that time. They're hesitant to begin with, but they really do not like to be photographed then. This was Tink, who I sat next to in a cafe, who's actually a percussionist who I've seen play. And this is a picture, he's Muslim, but this is a picture of his spiritual leader that he showed me. So there's these incredible hairdressing salons that sometimes have 50 seats, African, and everybody's having something different done. And I've been trying for now 4 years to get in one of them to photograph them because they're really incredible. And I was told by a number of my friends, most of my female friends, women do not like to be documented where they're in preparation. So, but I did get in. So everybody says, go see Baba Cool. And Baba Cool is one of the big hairdressers in Sebastopol area, and Baba Cool said, you can't photograph them, although I did get somebody in the mirror, but he was very willing to pose. And you see he's got a Chicago Bull hat. He's ready. So I had a chance to participate in an exhibit at the Cité de la Musique called Great Black Music. It was this was in 2014. It was the Cité de la Musique has the music school that trains most of the French classical musicians. It has a really actually interesting museum and a recital hall. So someone had decided to do an exhibit about sort of music by people of African descent all over the diaspora. And it began with kind of sort of traditional African rhythms, Afro-pop, Afro-Cuban, Brazilian, Cape Verde, rhythm and blues, and New Orleans. And so I got a chance to exhibit work from the New Orleans book in an exhibit that was up for 6 months. And 80,000 people saw it, and it was not, I think it was mostly French. I mean, the French really were interested, and there was always big crowds. And I happened to be there for a month during the summer it was up, so I had a chance to go back, and I could show off to all my French friends that I was exhibited. And contrary to popular belief, Michael is actually alive and living in France. Did we see that one again? Geez, I did one repeat. So someone said, you need to go to this place called Les 104. It was a former mortuary that the French government had taken over, and actually it has 3 or 4 world-class galleries. Ai Weiwei showed there, and theaters, and a large open space where a lot of kids come and practice capoeira and hip-hop. And it's a place I always go back to photograph because I was interested in sort of seeing young people and how they were functioning in the society and what they were doing. So that's like a little bit. I've shown some of this work at a laser talk for John Weber and the Institute of Art and Science. But now we'll get to the meat of the, well, no, there's one more in Paris. So the other thing was I also have shown the New Orleans work during a festival in Rennes in Brittany. And it turns out the reason there's a big brass band tradition in New Orleans is because there's a brass band tradition in France. And that was one of the things that was the instruments that the slaves had access to in New Orleans. So it turns out in Rennes, there's a whole brass band scene, and the best musicians went to New Orleans and studied with Ronald Lewis, who's down there in the front. And so they did a kind of workshop and showed my pictures, and then I had an exhibit, and after the exhibit, they did a second line through Rennes that was very much like New Orleans. It was people got right in line, and they went through the public housing where the African and Arab residents came out and got in line exactly like they're in the lower Ninth Ward. I thought it was really interesting. So that basically was another kind of both my connection to and an idea of sort of culture sort of traveling back and forth from one place to the other. So with that exhibit, the people of the University of Rennes said, besides an honorarium, where would you like to go in France? And I said, I hear there's this refugee camp in Calais. I think I'd like to go there. That was in fall of 2015. So they set it up, and I actually got a connection with someone from an NGO and arrived in Calais and went to an area that is, some people refer to as the jungle. It was interesting. Some of the in residence sort of liked that and kind of wore it as a badge of honor, and other people really did not like what it implied. So I sort of use it with qualifications, the term the jungle. When I was there were 3,000 people from Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Kosovo, Pakistan, mostly sort of in areas, but all kind of together, and it really was a city. This was on the outskirts of Calais, and originally they were there because the word was if you could get through the Channel, it was much easier to get residency and work in England. So this was still the line on the sort of transport, but it turned out about a month before I got there, the English had paid for the French to put up, I think you'll see it later, a fence that looked almost exactly like the fence at Tijuana. There must be a design for border fences that the person whose name I will not mention, I'm assuming is going to consult. So this is what Calais looked like. And there were upwards of 100 people arriving there a day. There were 3,000 people when I was there, and by the end of the year, it was up to 5,000. These gentlemen were from the Sudan. And the other thing, I guess I had a notion that all refugees, I was thinking about in Ethiopia during the drought. Basically what's going on, besides sort of war refugees, there's a lot of people leaving. The best and brightest from all these countries are leaving for opportunities, obviously, and a lot of them were educated, professionals, middle class, lots of cell phones, lots of people going into town to get money out of the bank. So that was not across the board, but the kind of reality was very different than I think what my expectations were. This guy was a economist and was hoping to get, at this point, to get papers in Germany. Here's two men playing Makala, which is a kind of, they're improvising it, but an African game, or actually a game that seems to exist in different forms in different parts of the world. This site was actually a former dump, and in fact they said there's actually a lot of asbestos there, so that was kind of an issue. But I was, kind of interested in what people were doing and what they were doing to occupy their time, and I think even after it was clear that they were not going to be able to get to England, I think they did like the idea of being in a place with a critical mass of people from the place they came from with common language. And the people in the NGO said that this was probably, at that point, was probably the smoothest run and self-run camp of all the camps in Europe and the Middle East. And the problem was Calais is also kind of one of the centers for Marie Le Pen and the National Front, the right-wing group, so there was pressure from some members of Calais for it to be disbanded. And in fact, the residents said that they did not go into town on the weekends because people were drunk, and that would be a time when it was dangerous for them. Here's someone called a prayer in a mosque that was set up in this tent. I was just there for 3 days, but it was amazing. I made a large body of work that's been published in a number of places and sort of led to me applying for the Dickinson grant because I think this work parallels but is also separate from the kind of work I'm doing, the work I've been calling the sort of black presence in France, which may be changing. Well, here's someone who's been there for a while. You can see he's really kind of made himself at home. And with all those people, I mean, you can imagine it was probably having an impact on the environment. And so when I was there, the second day I was there, all of a sudden all these French army people showed up. And we asked them, they said, so what's going on? And they said, oh, it's just strictly routine, but the refugees, I want to talk a little bit about the term refugee also. I haven't been able to come up with a better word, but it's really a problematic word, and a word that a lot of this group that I've been spending time with has a problem with. So if anybody can think of another, the problem is like wanderer or journeyer or human being is not specific enough, so I'm working on that if anybody has any ideas. So anyway, the inhabitants said they had never seen the police. It was the first time they'd arrived. And it turned out they were coming in support of a lot of French immigration officials who were offering free transport back to where they came from if they would fill out forms. Here they are here, and the people are sort of asking them questions, and people are reading it. And here's a group of actually very cool young men from Sudan who were passing the papers back without filling them out because they figured if they filled them out, they would be in the system in a way they would not, and they did not want to go home, that they were going to wait out their chance to sort of be able to find their way somewhere in Europe. There was a section that was not accessible to people from the outside that had women and children. I did see some evidence of children. And there were a number of volunteers from both England and France that were bringing food and supplies and housing, tents. And they had just started sort of dealing with the idea of sanitation just as I had gotten there. My friend Robert Dawson, who's actually a graduate of here, has been working on a project on libraries all over the world, and he went to Calais and photographed the fact that they did have a number of series of libraries where people could, borrow books and return them. And there was, you can see, here's the example of the fence, sort of right on the edge of the camp, and some workers working on it. This is literally, this is very close to the port of Calais, so people would jump this fence that had razor wire, and the Médecins du Monde, one of the NGOs, was almost every day treating people trying to get over the fence who'd been cut by the razor wire. So an English theater group had set up this big geodesic dome, and I think you saw a picture of it before. And so the night I was there was the first night they had actually used it. And all these Arab and African young men, mostly, young men who are incredibly beautiful, I might add. They're like almost I couldn't take my eyes off of them. And I think they also had this kind of carriage. I heard their stories. They went through these horrendous, horrible stories of having me get to Western France, and yet they had this kind of calm, which was kind of reassuring. It was really incredible. And they were doing, they had boom boxes, and they were doing spoken word and hip hop, and they were really good. And another example of how this art form has resonated with people all over the world. And they've sort of made it their own. So it was really interesting that all of a sudden now there were stores and then sort of gallows humor about kind of where they were. This was actually a group of people in the tent from Kosovo who were kind of fake hiding from me, but I thought that was interesting that there was literally where the sort of reach that people were coming from was much wider than I was expecting. And again, when people first got there, they usually were able to sort of get temporary housing and then usually sort of settled into tents, although the French were also trying to get them to move into containers that had locks on them that the people were not going for. So here's a generator where everybody's charging their cell phones. It's interesting that the cell phone is obviously a really important sort of tool in this journey. So in March, 6 months after I was there, well, no, it's funny, a week after I was there, because the soldiers had shown up, about 300 of the residents jumped the fence and tried to walk through the channel to England. I think they were rounded up because they knew something was up, because all of a sudden the army had appeared. But by March, the French had tried a number of guys, as though I have mixed feelings about the French, but they have not been handling their refugee and migrant situation very well. So they came in originally and tried to get people to move in these containers, and they didn't do that. And then they came in with tear gas and basically destroyed a lot of the tents. This is from a site called Jungle Eye, which is kind of a media site. And some Syrians actually, in protest, sewed their mouths closed in protest of this kind of action. But this is by March. So when I was there, the camp, actually a little after I was there, the camp with about 5,000 or 6,000 people looked like this. And then after they came in, it looked like the bottom picture. Although, again, 100 people were showing up a day, and by the spring, it was up to 10,000 people. So the French they displaced some people, and they would just let them go, maybe not even that far from Calais, and they would just come back, because that was kind of where their infrastructure. So last summer, in June, I came to Paris and had some friends that lived near Canal de Saint-Martin, and at that point there was a encampment of, again, people from Africa and the Middle East. This is the entrance to the Jerez metro. You can see jammed with tents and looking not that different than Division Street in San Francisco or certain parts of Oakland. So these people are kind of in a holding pattern, although periodically, every couple of weeks, the French police would come, the Parisian police would come in and sometimes allow people to take their possessions, sometimes throw all of the tents and their possessions in the dump, but then tell them to go away, and the people would come back in a couple of days. It was like this sort of vicious cycle that was not really solving anything. But again, I was it seemed like the conditions were much more difficult in Paris because they were basically camped under the metro station. They did have, water, and on some levels maybe they had access, but because there were such large numbers, I think most people were kind of stuck. It would be dangerous. They could be arrested if they sort of ventured too far away. But I was interested in kind of how people personalize their space. And what they did to occupy, and this kind of sense of kind of biding their time, but also kind of camaraderie. I mean, it's really strong. I think you can see here this example of people of a certain age, really, really beautiful. And some people said, "Don't take my picture. I don't want my picture on the record." But almost everybody, both in Calais and here, would want to tell me their stories or offer me tea. So I finally figured out that everywhere but here, this idea, regardless of what you have, it is offered. And we don't do it as much here. And so for a while I kept thinking, don't give me anything. And of course it was being really rude. And so I finally figured out that I should accept what people offer me. So I met a young man from Afghanistan who had to leave because he had actually been a translator for the U.S. Army. And so he'd been trying to call the U.S. Embassy because he was trying to get papers, and they wouldn't return his calls because when they gave him the certificate, they said, "You just show this and it'll open doors," and it wasn't opening doors, unfortunately. So that was in June, and then I was back, about a month ago, and it was raining. The weather was worse. The French had actually separated, so the Arabs were by Jerez and most of the Africans were by Stalingrad. So I'm not sure what that was about, but they had been all sort of in proximity and they were no longer. These from Eritrea. Here's someone doing his laundry. And actually, remember you saw the picture of the guy behind the bars. This was in this area, which had been filled with people, and it had been locked and was no longer, it was restricted, and people were not able to use this sort of fenced-off area. It was interesting, there was a exhibit at Jerez of photographs by Richard Avedon, which I thought was an interesting juxtaposition to what was happening underneath. So this past summer, a very good mutual friend of John Weber and I, Lydia Matthews, who teaches at the New School at Parsons and who also is Greek and has been trying to get me to go to Greece with her for years, said, "If you come to Greece, I will connect you with some refugee situation, which is very different than other places." So one of the things we did, we heard about this village that had been an abandoned resort and the mayor of that area was actually Syrian, and he had been able to secure it for Syrian families. So we arrived, people were very open. This is Mr. Kaur, who was a former university professor and showed me around, again, insisted that I eat. This is the mayor, the Syrian mayor, who was visiting that day. So what was nice is, because a lot of the camps had been reconstituted when the EU claimed the border, so some people were stuck in Greece because people did not want to stay in Greece because the Greeks are having enough problems as they are, but they were not able to move through as they had been before. So like I said, this was a former resort, and in fact, a month before I arrived, a 1-year-old had drowned in one of these pools. They've been trying to get them to empty it. But it was actually a place, it was probably about a half-hour walk to the nearest town, right on the Ionian Sea. And so at the summer, people were really happy because they were safe. The kids were starting to get activities. They originally had to sort of use food that was kind of K rations from the Greek army, and they were eventually, now they had been petitioning to be able to buy their own food. This says, I don't know if you can see it from there, it just says, "My son is very happy in Germany, thank you, Greece." There was a really strong, a lot of mosquitoes in this particular area. So there were, Muslims and Kurds and a variety of other people, almost all from Syria. And Kaur invited me to come to prayers at this makeshift mosque. Here he is cleaning himself before prayers. So when I went back, and this is like 3 or 4 weeks ago, things had changed. Some of the people that were there had been able to get papers and migrate mostly to Germany, but some people were in a holding pattern, and many of the men who had been there continuously were now starting to get frustrated because this area was pretty isolated. They were kind of cut off from their community and resources. Some of the men were starting to work in some of the agricultural fields nearby, but things had changed. The sort of atmosphere of the camp was different. But people had started to get pets. You can get a sense of what the camp looks like. I have to say one thing. In October, the light sort of on the western part of Greece was just incredibly beautiful. You know, they are burning partly just to occupy the time, but also to try to foil the mosquitoes. And then some volunteers from the UN came, who've been, for the most part, been helpful, but the residents had some complaints about kind of things that they were and were not doing. Of course, everybody's doing selfies. Yes. And I was really interested in how people were kind of improvising to kind of protect and personalize their spaces. This is a family. He actually is a resident in Germany, and she and the rest of the family made their way from Syria, and he had come to visit them and was working on getting them papers so they could all immigrate to Hanover, where he was living. And actually, I was sort of wondering about this, but this is the lines around her face are just a result of like kids her age, especially girls, playing with finger paints and makeup. So it's interesting. I don't know if you can see it. There's that red app. It's called For Freedom. He asked, he says, how much do you pay for internet? And I said, I do have a SIM card. And he says, I don't pay anything. So this is a kind of probably hacked program that refugees can use to communicate with without it costing, and wherever they are, which I thought was really interesting. So Lydia always reminds me that it's not enough to take pictures, you have to give back. So this is proof that I did. Incredible feast before I left. I have to say, we were genuinely, I did bring them prints, and we were both very genuinely glad to see each other, and I'm sort of keeping track. He has two sons living in Germany and is again waiting, and it's arbitrary who gets documentation and who doesn't. The other thing was there was this whole notion, I guess I had a stereotype of what Syrians and people around the Mediterranean look like, and these are primarily, there's a variety of people, but the blondes are Kurds. I don't know if this is a product of the Crusades, but it was interesting that there's a number of people from Syria, and I saw that in Athens also, who looked more European than the Greeks. So I spent some time in Athens. Athens is really interesting because the economy is so bad. There's a lot of abandoned buildings, and there's a whole kind of tradition of anarchists taking over spaces. This is a theater that was taken over, and the incredible murals all over Athens. And when we heard some music, and it turned out these are people from all over Africa who have a kind of ensemble, and they were rehearsing, and so we got to hear them play for a little while. And then one of the other places was the Hotel Plaza, which is a 6-story hotel that had been abandoned for 6 years, and a group of anarchists took it over, hooked up power, and now have housed about 1,000 people. There's the 6th-month anniversary was last week, a couple weeks ago. So when I was there this summer, they said, come on, we're going on a demonstration. And it was this demonstration led by Syrians from the squats all over Athens, and they were converging in the middle to the middle of Athens. And they were, the demonstration was against closed borders and against racism. And there's a whole kind of strong kind of labor and left activist tradition in Greece. And so I was interested in who was there and what they were doing. So last month, I was able to get back into the hotel. It's interesting, all these places, most of the official places, I was not able to photograph. But the anarchists, usually if I'd be vetted and I have to kind of explain myself, and they said, "You're not mainstream media," and I said, "Absolutely not." And so I was able to get some access. This is actually the lobby of this hotel. And I know when I was there, like people were showing up continuously trying to get on a list, because this is actually a pretty prime and comfortable place to stay. And I remember I was photographing about 6 at night and saw very few adults, but the kids were having a great time and kind of using the space. How's everybody doing? We're close to the end, I promise. So the thing that was really interesting to me is eventually, I think you probably know in Calais, they finally actually took the refugees in buses and took them to different parts of France. Like the disadvantage was they were no longer with large groups of their countrymen, but I think they had shelter, and they finally, because this was something that the Greeks had been doing all along. So, but they weren't doing that in Paris. They were basically doing this kind of ring around the rosy merry-go-round thing, and eventually I got some photographs from my friends. Because a couple times they took people away in buses and they just let them out on the outskirts of Paris and then they'd come back. So they actually found shelter for a significant number of the people both in Calais and in Paris. Although in Calais there were a lot of unaccompanied minors, young people who they were trying to get the English to take, and it was taking a while to process them. So I'm not sure that's not completely resolved. And again, people keep showing up. So everybody said, "Do you want to go to Calais?" I says, "No, it'll still be there, and I have a feeling it will be because it sort of keeps enduring." So there was a kind of collective that was kind of running the hotel, and they actually were happy. They sort of, after they figured I was okay, they were using some of my photographs for a publication for their anniversary. This is actually another squat that we had gone to originally, and this is my friend Johnny, who's Greek and English, who's a radio producer, and we both, again, had to be vetted. He is very interested in LGBT issues, and was going to do these kind of radio documentaries and also help these organizations that were trying to raise money. So both Lydia and I had heard about a place called Orange House that was a center for gay and lesbian refugees, but we could never find it. But we sort of found, I found it like when I was there last month, and what had happened in this, let me go back, in this center, someone had actually firebombed it about 6 weeks after I was there in the summer. So kind of security and protection was much more important. There's not a large right-wing group in Greece, but it's pretty virulent. And they are kind of active, so people are kind of being aware of it. So anyway, we found the Orange House, and they said, "Please don't identify the address or the faces of anybody that works there." So I had this idea: why don't you let me photograph you in front of the door? As a way of kind of showing the place without really showing it and not showing your identity. So that was interesting. And then the next night, Johnny said, we've been invited to a meeting of gay and lesbian refugees from Syria and other parts of the Middle East, and a group that's supporting it because they're trying to, they actually were not happy with the Orange House. So again, I went to the meeting. Johnny's gay and mentioned that he is going to be in Athens over the long run, that when he does radio, it protects everybody's anonymity. And then they said, and you? And I said, well, I'm straight, and I'm a photographer that actually shows people's faces, and I'm leaving tomorrow. But they let me photograph anyway. What happened was we just said anybody who does not want their face shown can leave. So a number of actually young men left the room. And then I went out and found them, and we sort of did that same situation because they said they were real interested in having their presence shown, but they couldn't have their identity. Literally, in Syria, ISIS is throwing people identified as gay off of the roofs of buildings and then making people in the crowd stone them. So that's the sort of reality, and some of that was going on in some of the camps. And again, I was sort of interested in the iconography and sort of what the drawings I was seeing on the walls in Athens. I went to an academic conference at actually a squat that was a former theater. And it was interesting, someone in Greece sort of raised the issue of why was this conference in English. And it sort of raised the idea that in most of the camps, English is the lingua franca because that's the way the Afghanis and the people from Somalia can communicate. So I guess the moral of that is the winners get to the naming rights. So I wanted to show this picture. I'm almost finished. I did get a chance to go to South Africa just before I came home. I went to a conference. And an issue that was always recurring in terms of a lot of this work, in fact, since I've been a photographer, is kind of what rights do I have and what rights do the people that are in front of my camera have? And usually, especially in this circumstance, you almost always ask, except for in France when I can't communicate in French. So we were coming back from actually a reception at the American Embassy in Pretoria. And in South Africa, there's a whole kind of thing about people on the street, asking for food or asking for money. And this was at night, and I had actually talked to a couple of people when I was in cars, but there was a guy in this incredible robe. I mean, he looked like a biblical figure, and I'd had a couple glasses of wine, and I started taking pictures, and he noticed me, and he came over, and the window was down, and he started to grab my camera. So the sort of moral of this was the picture that I tried to take. And usually when I try to photograph surreptitiously, the pictures don't come out. They're not very good or they don't come out. So I figure there's some force that's keeping me from working that way, which I think is really interesting. So I just wanted to show you that I didn't get the picture of the guy who looked like a biblical figure. And he didn't get my camera. And I absolutely said to my friends, I said, he absolutely had a right to not be photographed. And it's an issue that, sometimes I'll be hesitant when it is not of a problem. And then sometimes I have to navigate, and it's usually me. I have to kind of build up my energy. I've been doing this for 40 years. It's never easy. Although I do know when I'm on a run that most people will not say no to me. It's very interesting. And when I'm not, people that it would be their advantage for me to photograph them are suspicious. So I don't know what all that's about, but I guess it's protecting me from being the exploited media. So here's just a couple. I wasn't going to do it, but I'll show you a couple of pictures from South Africa. This is in Cape Town. And I was just interested in, I don't know what my expectations in South Africa were, but it is an area with a country that has 10% people that I guess we would call white. And then there's a certain percentage of people that were designated as colored. And it's about 85 or 90% African. And there's some complications. There's supposedly the president is pretty corrupt and probably will not get another term. On the other hand, everybody seems, and again, I don't always trust my first impressions, but they seem very chill. The people seem to be getting along. Obviously, the economy seems to be well. There's a lot of economic disparity, but there's a large, robust black middle class. So and there seemed to be a lot of expats, especially African Americans living there, and it seemed much closer in terms of culture to here than anywhere in Europe I was. So I've had some people since then said, I think you missed some stuff, but we'll see. And I think, besides the sort of migration, I'm really interested in kind of people and what they're doing and what they're wearing and where they're living. So this guy, I love this guy's face, and then I found out later he's actually the poet laureate of South Africa. So I have good instincts. Yeah. And this is actually a really incredible South African artist who I've actually photographed a number of times. She's been at the 3 conferences. And this is in this giant mall that was interesting, both who was there. It's on the outskirts of Johannesburg. And this is actually the apartheid hotel, or the apartheid museum. There are 3 or 4 museums I went to in South Africa that probably rendered history the most effective I've ever seen anywhere in the world. There was actually really out in front. In the apartheid museum, when you buy a ticket, you get a pass, and arbitrarily you're assigned a race, and mine was white and blanc. And I got really upset. I said, wait a minute, there's a mistake. And they said, no, you get what you are assigned, and so you have to enter the museum in a certain way. And it was interesting that I was so upset about it, but it was really effective and got my attention. It was a really interesting way to sort of render that. So I think we are finished, and thank you very much. And if people have questions, please wait for the mic. I'd be very curious about your sort of ideas about what the hell you think I'm doing, because I'm trying to figure it out. Thank you, Jim. Oh, we've got 2 mics. Anybody with a question or comment? Here's one over here. Actually, while that's coming, I did have one more story to tell you. In the village in Greece, I was with Bridget Auger, who's graduated from here in social documentary, who has been spending whose parents are Greek and who is fluent in Arabic. And it happened she was in Greece when I was there, so I absolutely had her as either I was her research assistant or she was mine. It was really incredible. And then I had a student that I think Norma knows, what is her name? Angela Dotson, who I had in 2008. She was probably one of the strongest students I ever had. She was very interested in photography and installation, and I knew she was from South Africa. So at the very end, about the time and quarter we are now, I'm not doing it. She said, I've been wanting to do this piece about South Africa, where my parents are from. Her parents had left right after Mandela came to power. And she did this amazing thing where she sort of replicated a tattoo on her back, and the gist of what she did was that Mandela was a terrorist. So I've been writing about this. I had a sort of existential sort of crisis as a teacher, because on one hand, I think our role is to help people to carry out their ideas as successfully as possible, and yet I have my own politics. And in her case, because she was so smart, I encouraged her to make sure whatever she was going to do to really take it to its conclusion. So, and we didn't say a lot about it. And I remember there were some people visiting during open studios, and there were people who were double taking. And so when Mandela died, she sent me a video of the Soweto choir sort of celebrating, and didn't say anything, but I think it was her way of saying she had finally made her own conclusion about that. So when I arrived in South Africa, I sent her a message saying, guess where I am? And she wrote me back saying, guess where I am? And she's in South Africa. Since she graduated with an art degree here, she has spent a year at Harvard and a couple of other graduate programs, and she's gotten involved in public health. So she's in Johannesburg, working for the USAID and the South African government, doing AIDS treatment and policy. And this is a shout out for the strong value of arts education. We have people doing in medical school, a couple are even being artists, but the idea of being able to solve problems, work with limited resources, which we're very good at, actually is something that I really didn't even discover until I came here. So that was my South African story. And I loved the fact that maybe my instincts were right, and I knew she would come around, and she did. So that was my question.
I was wondering what your perception is of how people perceive you as an American when you travel.
Yeah. Well, there are times when that is not the sort of the thing that I wear on my sleeve. I think I have ambiguous ethnicity, which works most of the time. So what happens is, actually, I think the French liked me because they weren't sure. They didn't know if I was Algerian. I didn't know. And as long as I didn't speak French, I was okay. And that's that. So I don't know. It seems to work to my advantage, and except for when it doesn't. But I think, I mean, what I noticed in the camps, people were really interested that I was from California, whatever that means, and that I was American, and it seemed, it was not, I remember there was an Afghani guy, and I said, you know, I'm really sorry what we did to your country, and he kind of laughed, and he said, well, it's, you know, it wasn't all bad. I mean, it was interesting. We sort of had this, he was not going to let me just do a mea culpa. I mean, we had a back and forth about it, so it was interesting. So, I don't know. You know, the camera is both, it gives me an excuse to go places where I have no business. It's also kind of a barrier. You know, you just have to just sort of negotiate it. And I always have it out from the beginning, so it's clear. Some people will wait, but I'm usually moving through things too quickly. Anybody else?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for sharing your perspective. Through your images, you mentioned a couple times that people asked you or wanted to make sure that you weren't mainstream media.
Yes.
And so, is it that they're coming from a place of they think they're not going to be treated fairly by mainstream media, or is it the way that mainstream media approaches people in their photography, or maybe just talk a little bit.
Well, this was
about that.
primarily these anarchists that had these incredible collectives, and they had a meeting for everything, and it really did function. I have to say, I have mixed feelings about collective activity. I really love it in my heart, but it doesn't always work. But they seem to really, I mean, they were making these spaces that were empty, and the government was actually allowing them to do it because they were actually taking care of refugees more humanely, more efficiently and cheaper than the government and the officials and the NGOs were doing. So this is a miracle, I mean, an amazing thing that was going on, and something I didn't see in Germany or France in terms to that extent. So one of the kind of notions of that was they were very suspicious of kind of their image and of outsiders and what their intention was. And so they were the ones who were sort of asking that. They said, if you are like a journalist for a kind of mainstream American, photographer, you cannot come in here. I mean, not everybody said that, but 2 or 3 different groups said that. And I said, I'm basically, usually when people ask what I do, I guess I say I'm a long-term documentary photographer. So I'm not interested in kind of sort of fast hit it and miss journalism, although I do that sometimes. So I think somehow I was able to convince them. Maybe I looked sincere or something, I'm not sure. But I think what really was, in some cases, if I could bring work, then they could kind of see what I was doing, and the work really would speak for itself, if that makes sense. I think, in the camps, they didn't care about mainstream media. And in fact, in some ways, except for the kind of security issues I mentioned, some people would say no, they were really interested in this story being told, that the conditions under they were living, the narrative of how they had gotten there. And so that was actually, for the most part, something that people were readily kind of able to incorporate.
Yeah, thank you, Louis.
Yes,
Where's your next trip?
I am not going anywhere, at least till March or April. Although I actually need to, there's some sort of work in France I need to do, and I'm going to try to go to France and not go anywhere else because I've sort of gone through France. South Africa has absolutely gotten my attention. It's like real incredible, complex society that sort of this idea of how sort of bodies are functioning in a society, it really interesting and things that are maybe even more familiar than some of the places in Europe, and then things that I still have yet to open up. And I've met a lot of incredible artists. In fact, we should get, what's her name? The woman, yes, we should get her to see what we can do. She may be beyond that, but we'll see. Yes.
I have just a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the civil rights movement has like holds a special interest, in France.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, in what sense? Is it because they look at the photographs of the sit-ins, or they look at the photographs of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers? What is it about our civil rights movement?
I think it's broader than that. I think they're really interested in African American culture. In World War I, there's a army troop from Harlem that sort of came and paraded, and the French absolutely kind of reacted to jazz. So that was the beginning of it. And then all the artists throughout the 20th century, James Baldwin, the people that he mentioned, were able to sort of find support. Some of whom never bothered to. I think Chester Himes never learned how to speak French. But they were able to sort of function. So there is the French seem to. I don't know if they get it, but they seem to really be. And I would say I know a lot of jazz musicians that would starve to death if it wasn't for the fact that every small village in the south of France has a festival all summer, and musicians from Jamaica and Cape Verde and a lot of jazz musicians have steady work all through Europe. And that Europeans come to New York and don't know they're supposed to be scared to go to Harlem, and they're lined up around the block in front of Abyssinian. So I think it has and the other thing in terms of the French of African descent is I don't think that there was slavery on the geographic confines of France, although there were in the colonies. And somehow that seems to make a difference. That's a real big difference between here and there. And so I think, like I said, that the music exhibit that I was a part of, the French were very interested in, and this exhibit, which was being very well attended, is just that's the aspect of that culture the French seem to be really interested in.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was very interested in the pictures in Calais and how few sort of mixed gender groups there seem to be there. Yeah. And you mentioned that there was one area that you weren't encouraged or allowed to get to.
Weren't allowed to, yeah.
Kids and women are. Did you find out anything else about just the situation there in terms of even in the dance? It was all guys.
Yes, this seems to be primarily a bachelor society, although not completely. There were some Ethiopian Christians where the women were sort of in that area of the camp. There were men and women, but it seemed to be. I mean, I remember asking about it. It seemed that was sort of, especially among the Muslims, but I think some others, that was an area that was off limits. And I think that was one of the areas where a lot of the unaccompanied minors might have been also. So yeah, it was a bachelor society across the board. I saw more families in the hotel in Greece, and obviously in that village in the Peloponnese. But yeah, it was it was interesting that to sort of whenever there was a woman I could photograph, I sort of jumped on it if I could, because it was unusual and hard to access. Yes, Kimberly.
Thank you so much for this overview of your work and your travels and research. You gave us a teaser at the beginning about your use of black and white.
Yes.
And I wanted to hear the follow-up to that,
okay.
like when you chose to start using color and what that meant for you.
I think it coincided with me using digital, and going to Cuba. The sort of, in West Oakland, in New Orleans, in Harlem, a little bit in Chicago. I think I was interested in rendering things with an idea about the past and then a sort of documentary tradition. It's funny that I have published a series of the work from Calais in black and white because I was thinking it was kind of more in the documentary tradition, and I may do that again, but I think as it overlaps with the sort of work I've been doing in France, and also applying for grants, I'm just doing all that in color. I still love black and white. It seems to be hard to lug film cameras around Europe these days as I get older. But I think that at this point, I'm kind of more interested, not making a reference to a kind of traditional way of rendering a documentary, but showing something where I'm allowing color to be maybe more contemporary. And I like the way it describes the world in a different way.
Hi, thanks. I'm a political activist, and I've been exploring for a long time homelessness, and I lived in New Orleans, and poverty and related issues, and I'm really struck when I look at your photographs at the similarities that I see, not only to the homeless camps that I see here in the refugee camps, but also just the structure of space, the way the houses look, the way the anarchist space looks, and so forth. So my question is this. What is the most visionary or unique structure that you have seen in these various places that you've been, in terms of the shape of a place, in terms of it housing people? Have you seen any really interesting or really novel spaces where people are being housed?
Do you remember the picture? I didn't show it for very long, but it was in Calais, and there was a guy talking on a cell phone, and he's really personalized his space. I mean, I thought it was interesting so people had been there for 3 or 4 months, and some people have been in the hotel since it opened, like in Athens, since it opened 6 months ago. So they had been there straight. I think everybody was clear that this was temporary housing. I mean, they were going to do everything they could to be as comfortable as possible, but that was, and I think the one difference between, downtown or in Oakland is I think people are there for different reasons. I would say that the homeless are maybe there all are there for necessity, but the necessity comes from for different causes. And like I said, I heard stories of people being on those rafts where everybody drowned but them, and you'd think they'd have post-traumatic syndrome, but they were, and it did come out. Like in Calais, there was some violence and things went on, and I think a little bit, I saw some evidence of it. But for what they've been through, the fact that everybody was being cooperative and collective and making the most of, and making themselves comfortable and finding shelter was really phenomenal and a miracle. And it is true, that's a model that seems to be happening all over the world right now. Yes.
Louis, thank you for that. You showed us a lot of pictures, wonderful pictures. But as any photographer knows, you took many more pictures than you showed us.
That's true.
And I was wondering if you'd be willing to reflect a bit on your principles of selection, or why you pick certain pictures and not other pictures, and what makes a good picture, and were there certain kinds or classes of pictures that you decided not to show?
For like I said, my favorite thing about doing this now is that I literally just got off the plane. I literally, a couple days ago I was looking at photographs probably for the first or second time. So in this case, I don't know, I was going to think, there's people in the room that knows I always cast a wide sweat and show too much work. But for this, it was really important for me to kind of see a thread that I kind of had an idea about. Believe me, there's whole other stories we didn't even get to yet. I figured you had enough. But it's funny though, today I had to make 20 prints to represent the sort of notion of, to represent this lecture. I had to do 20 images, which just about drove me crazy because I was able, things were out of context, and I was interested I'm going to be interested to see how the people that'll see a little bit of exposition from me, whether it'll work or not. I'm just not sure. You know, sort of picking images that I thought worked, but with the connection between them, I'd be interested to see if it works. Well, you know, I showed like 5 pictures from South Africa. And I have a lot of pictures from Greece, from life in Greece, that I, you know, didn't think was appropriate for this, but which I will probably show at some other point. I'll tell one more story. For some reason, well, I know why. I'm really attracted to the Greek Orthodox Church. I think they can marry. I don't think they've been caught diddling little boys, I'm not sure. But the aesthetic is incredible, and it really is an incredible part of the Greek culture. So I was invited to a festival. I think I can't remember what they were doing, but there were a lot of people there. They really are into icons. All the people sort of kiss the saints. And these people are, you know, they look like Hebrew, you know, wise men from back in the day with the long beards. So, and they said, there's no problem photographing. I could not, I took very few photographs. I really felt, I had permission to it, but I sort of felt, I'm not even sure, I had to think about it. I guess I felt like I didn't know enough to kind of to take advantage of that situation. I think that's what, it threw me because that's what I do. And this was a chance, I know these are photographs that would have been really strong, but those were pictures I didn't take. And there's times when I have to talk myself into walking in the streets and encountering people. And I would say, usually about 70 to 90% of the time, it's fine. Even if they say no, the worst they can do is say no. But there's sometimes when that question or the ask is more difficult than others. And I don't have it completely down, but it's always interesting to me. I can kind of tell, it's a good barometer about where I am in terms of the questions I ask and then how people respond to me. And
okay.
Yeah.
Well, Louis,
yes.
I'm sure people...
It may be time, yes.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. There are refreshments out there. I'm sure Louis will be happy to talk to you up here. Yeah. So thanks for coming and enjoy the refreshment.
Thank you.